Now we have heard all the pilot presentations, and it's time to move on to our panel discussion. So I welcome to our virtual floor our panelists. We have Toni Cederberg from Husö Biological Station and the Government of Åland. We have Mikhail Durkin from Coalition Clean Baltic. We have Jakob Hagberg from he's head of delegation for Sweden in HELCOM. We have Marjo Gustavsson, whom you already met, County Administrative Board of Östergötland. We have Seppo Knuuttila from the Finnish Environment Institute, and then we have Marjo Tarvainen from the ELY Center here in Uusimaa. So please join the discussion and put on your videos. So let's start with the first question then. So based on the presentations we just heard, what kind of risks do you see in the piloted measures? And this question goes to all panelists. So let's start with alphabetical order. So Toni Cederberg, could you start?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, it's clear that based on these pilots, it's clear that it's very hard at this stage to say anything about, for instance, about long-term effects. And that's one thing that I would like to see more about. And also, in some cases, the way that the pilots were scaled up showed that we should have taken more things into consideration and not scale up the pilots so drastically from laboratory studies. That's another thing that I would want to bring forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Toni. What about Mikhail? What do you think?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And I would basically say the same. It's about the risks are connected to the scale. Mostly so far what we have seen are limited scale pilots, and some of those are even referred not to marine waters but to lakes, and we know that there have been experiences in lakes since long, but we do not know and neither have long data and time series for the application in seawaters, even in the closed bays, because, well, frankly, we would prefer to see first the pilots in the enclosed bays and limited isolated areas of the sea, certainly not going further offshore before we have the knowledge. In general, well, I don't know whether it is the risk, but in general, our main concern from the NGO community is that we may see a refocus, or we are already seeing at the policy level, unfortunately, the refocus from land-based measures that are still there, and we want them to be implemented effectively, and we do not want them to be replaced by sea-based measures. So if we accept sea-based measures, those should be combined or should be complementary to the land-based work that we are doing for many, many years already. And of course, the EIA, environmental impact assessments, would need to be there. So I think I would stop here.
Thank you, Misha. Maria, what is the perspective of a regional authority?
As the previous speaker said, that it should be combined with land-based measures. And we also, so I know everything about the project, so I just think that there is a risk with the increase of the pH when you spread the marl. We see that as a risk, and also we see a risk with in the sedimental removal with the increase stirring of the sediments and increase of toxins and heavy metals in the water volume, and that's kind of the main risks that we see. But we also see that it's a possibility to develop these methods.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Jakob, how does the Swedish government see this issue?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for these presentations. I think it's really interesting and clarifying to see these results from this. It's also very helpful for an administrator to get these good compilations of where we are. I think it depends on what you mean by risk here, but I would like to point to a risk that we, as far as I've seen so far, there isn't any one of these that seems to have to be the silver bullet that will solve the problem, and not even in coastal waters. And I think there is a risk that we invest efforts in measures that looks nice but they actually have limited effect. So I think we have to be aware that we have limited resources, and we have to think about investing them in the measures that really will make a difference for the marine status of coastal waters. First of all, as I understand, these trials have been to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jakob. What about Seppo, Knuuttila, and you are not the Finnish government, but at least the Finnish Environment Institute, which is a governmental research institute. So,
yes, as Jakob said, I also agree, but on the basis of his presentations, so we have not yet found this silver bullet, as you also stated in your press release, for reducing internal nutrient load. If I look this presentation and think about the possible risks those methods might pose from the point of view of marine environment, I would say that I only see risks in sediment removal. It might affect also negatively, at least for some period on the water quality. But most of these methods seems to be safe in that perspective, that they don't seem to be harmful to the marine environment. And some methods are already, I would say, ready in that terms, but I could give them a code signal like this building like factories and artificial reefs. They seem to have only positive impact on marine predatory fish stocks, and they don't pose any risk if they are well designed projects. That was my first view of these pilot projects.
yes, thank you, Seppo. And Marjo Tarvainen, now the Finnish local authorities' view on risks.
Yes, I totally agree with the previous speakers, and I think that the aim is to have improved water quality or improved sediment condition, but the risk here is that these measures are not enough to decrease the internal nutrient loading, and therefore we need, of course, the reduction of external nutrient loading, which is the most important thing to do. And when we have decreased this external nutrient loading, then we can use these sea-based measures as an additional method, but we cannot use only these sea-based measures. We definitely need the nutrient load reduction from the land.
Yeah. Thank you, Marjo. Now maybe this is Finnish style, because in Finland you always start with negative issues and risks and problems. So let's move now on to possibilities. That's of course the other side. That's, as Anna-Mari started, that's the hope. That's why we are interested in this. So Jakob, you represent both the, in a way, HELCOM and Sweden views. So what kind of possibilities do you find in the utilization of these measures as part of the future marine water protection solutions?
Well, I think the possibilities really remain to be seen, how possible it is actually to use those methods. But I think for us, that's really two main parts on the issue of internal loading that I think is important for us. The first one relates to timing. We know that if we're just going to rely on natural processes to flush out the excess nutrients of the Baltic Sea, it's going to take a long time. And we are already feeling the effects of climate change starting to impact the ecosystem. So question is, do we have time to wait for that to happen by itself? We see some species such as cod already being in a quite serious state. So the question is, do we need to accelerate actually the improvement speed of the Baltic? I think so that's one issue. Another issue is, do we want to wait that long? I would like to see an improvement in the Baltic within my lifetime and not wait 50 years. And actually, with all the efforts put into this, I think it's important to be able to show to the public and to politicians that all the money invested, all the efforts are actually paying off, that we see improvement. So I think the timing is one important part on this, that maybe we cannot afford to wait forever for the Baltic to improve, actually. So it's part of the climate adaptation needs to actually quite quickly start to strengthen the ecosystem of the Baltic. I think the second thing to keep in mind that some have mentioned is that the internal loading we see today is the result of historic inputs. So it's definitely so that those inputs have to be stopped. And we also see some stakeholders using this as an argument that the internal loading is the largest input, and therefore we should focus there rather than the inputs. But we must remember that this actually comes from the land sources, as some mentioned. But at the same time, we need to look into the possibility to start actually acting on the internal loading as well. So I don't think one should exclude the other, but to invest enormous amounts of money in internal loading measures, as it would be if we did it in the open sea, without stopping the inputs from land, would be a waste of money, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jakob. I very much relate, especially with this, how long do we have to wait, and impatience. That's one of the, I would say, traits of our foundation, that we really, really would like to see results, and I guess we all share the same hope. By the way, all the panelists, I forgot to say that if you want to comment on something, you can use the raise hand function, because I see some of you might continue from something that someone else said. But let's ask now this question about opportunities also from the regional authorities, because that's where maybe mostly the opportunities lie at the moment. So Marjo, how do you see the opportunities of these measures in regional scale?
Yes, I think some of these measures might be used as an additional measures if there is clear scientific evidence that they are actually working and improving the water quality. And well, there are quite many eutrophic coastal bay areas, for example, in our area in Uusimaa, where is needed some restoration measures, but most of them are well, not most, but many of them belong to Natura 2000 network or are other nature conservation areas. So we need to be very careful what we can do on those areas so that we don't risk the nature values while they have been protected. But if we have some very problematic areas where we have constant anoxia and basically dead sediment, maybe in those sheltered bay areas, some of these measures might be useful. But of course, also in those areas, we need to first decrease the external nutrient loading, and after that, these can be used as additional measures.
Yeah, I see Misha raising his hand, but I take first Maria, still from the Swedish regional authorities. How do you see the role of these measures in your work in future?
As previously said, we agree that you have to work in several different ways with these measures, but we need to restore base now because the ecosystem cannot wait for us to decrease the nutrient load enough from the land. So we need to do both. We need to lower the nutrients from the land, and we need to restore the base. For like the pikes cannot wait and the perks can't wait either. So we need to boost the ecosystem now, and we should have done it for 10 years ago, but now is the second best to do it. So we need to start using these measures now for like pike factories. If you're going to do wetlands in Sweden to lower the nutrient reduction from the streams, we should do the wetlands as a multifunctional wetland to do a pike factory also, to just an extra boost and restoration.
Thank you, Maria. Now, Misha.
Okay, thank you, Marjukka. Actually, I wanted to continue about the pike factories, so I wouldn't sound completely negative about all the measures. But in fact, just to add to the pike factories, and increasing the squares of wetlands along the coast would actually help not only to limit, in that sense, internal loading, but actually also external loading, trapping and catching the inputs from land. And likewise, actually, with the stickleback removal or removal of trash fish in general. But I think stickleback deserves to be perhaps highlighted as the measure, despite of the rather cautious approach that needs to be applied anyway. But according to our fisheries expert, and also Jakob quite correctly pointed, the situation with the cod that we have in the Baltic Sea right now proves the need of removal of the competitors. The only risk we also see with that is that we would certainly meet or face the clash with the current regulations, fisheries regulations, with the need to change the mesh size, for example, of the fishing gear, and a threat or a risk of then bycatch or significant bycatch of herring and sprat along with sticklebacks. So this needs to be controlled, but in general, we are quite positive with regards to stickleback removal because of its abundance in the sea and, well, quite clear and evident opportunity it would provide.
Thank you, Misha. We know that Sweden have, oh, Seppo, please go ahead.
Just a short comment to Misha concerning this fisheries of stickleback, that and Nature Research Institute in Finland, they have had this experimental trawling in the Baltic Sea, and last summer they showed that if they trawl on the daytime in the surface layer, they get only or mainly stickleback, because herring comes to surface layer during the night. So it can be that kind changed the style how you draw according to which kind of fish you want to have.
Tony, please open your microphone.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the thing that was brought forward, that we should concentrate on limiting the runoff from land, also get better on recycling nutrients on land, and sea-based measures should instead be directed into habitat restoration, basically. That way we should, well, that was just what I wanted to comment on.
Thank you, Toni. And now to my question to Jakob, because Sweden is a superpower of sea-based measures, of course, in the Baltic Sea region. I think your government is a forerunner in, you have started early on thinking about these measures, and you have, to my understanding, already included some of these measures in your even national water policy program. So how do you see this issue in Sweden and the potential, like on a governmental level? We heard already on these timing issues, but it would be nice to hear, like, how far are you in Sweden?
I would say that, of course, yes. It depends what you mean by internal loading measures. But of course, some of these examples we heard here, like restoring wetlands and pike spawning areas, and all that is of course part of our measures program. When it comes to more direct treatment of leaking sea bottoms, it's still on the experimental scale in coastal areas, I would say, where we still are doing pilot projects, but it's being used already in lakes to treat bottom sediments to stop the leakage of phosphorus from those bottoms. And so far, it seems to be working very well, and in some areas where the inputs to the lakes are very high, and where it's actually very difficult to handle the inputs, it's been discussed it's more cost efficient to try to treat the bottoms permanently with, for example, aluminium chloride that then binds phosphorus permanently, rather than trying to handle the runoffs into those lakes, especially in cities and so on. It's quite difficult when it's lakes there in those areas where you don't have it's a lot of atmospheric deposition on roads and so on that reaches those. So I think in general we are quite positive. We don't have any examples of where we've seen any negative effects of this. We must remember that these lakes usually have completely dead bottoms, and the treatment is, as such, is quite a natural process that we are replicating basically, or strengthening. So we're quite far on that, if you like to call it far. We think so. It works quite well. On the more coastal marine parts, it's still very much on an experimental level, I think, or pilot level. And I think there, for us, it really comes down to whether it's cost efficiently possible to do that all, because the costs of doing something more offshore or in marine areas is tremendously much higher. So there we really need to be very know what we're doing before we're starting something more outside of a pilot project. Thank you.
Yes, one of the Sweden's problems, of course, is that your coastline is very much fjord-like. You have this very, very deep and sort of difficult fjords, which tend to get very eutrophied easily. So that's one of the challenges you have there. Jakob, you also represent Sweden in HELCOM, so let's continue to HELCOM now. How do countries see this issue in HELCOM, and what is the attitude there towards these sea-based measures?
Well, I shouldn't reply for other countries in this case, really, but I can say as much that HELCOM is working on it. And we are right now developing a risk assessment framework for internal loading measures that we are working on. So it's definitely something that's being discussed. But I wouldn't like to comment on other countries' position on it. I think you know quite well the different pros and cons that have already been brought up today here, and those of course are on the table also in the HELCOM work.
Yeah, thank you. Misha, you raised your hand, and you are a former professional secretary of HELCOM, and you happen to know quite well how the discussion goes about this issue in HELCOM, so please.
Well, I would only compliment on Jakob saying that, yes, probably it's not the style in HELCOM to point to a specific country and their position about a specific issue. But I should say that it's right now quite a balanced situation, with some countries pushing forward for testing of sea-based measures more actively, and you may guess which are those countries. But some countries also say that, and since long say that, well, we do not want to see biomanipulation in the Baltic Sea region yet, and without cautious approach, without proper environmental impact assessment, and at a larger scale before we have the knowledge in front of us. So this is why, as Jakob said, the guidelines or the framework for risk assessment is under development right now. And we may see that till the upcoming ministerial meeting in HELCOM that will address revision of the Baltic Action Plan, that countries are coming closer in their positions. So far, there is no agreement. That's what I know. And we, as environmental watchdogs in HELCOM conditions or HELCOM circles, from the environmental NGOs' point of view, we always point to the need of thorough knowledge and thorough investigation and thorough risk assessment before we go forward with the wider application of sea-based measures. And I also would like to actually support Tony's very important point about the restoration of habitats rather than biomanipulation per se that was presented in the pilots as the way and the path forward.
Yes, Seppo, you have also been for a long time present in HELCOM's meetings, so.
Yeah, it's just as Misha mentioned, this some countries are strongly against any kind of biomanipulation of a Baltic Sea. It's a little bit confusing, taking into account that we have biomanipulated Baltic Sea in a negative way at least 100 years. Like, for example, cod stock is in the brink of collapse because of very strong biomanipulation by us. And still, if we try to do some positive biomanipulation, so it's much more difficult than negative biomanipulation.
Yes. Yeah, this is actually a good sort of start for discussing these conflicting views, and these discussions about sea-based measures very often seem to raise conflicts and very sort of emotional reactions and feelings. And even within HELCOM, I can confess that we are also HELCOM observers, our foundation, so we have been witnessing quite heated discussion on this and very differing opinions of different countries on sea-based measures. So why is this so? And I'm going to ask this question from all the panelists, and so that we are very just. Let's start the other way around. So Marjo gets to comment first from the reverse alphabetical order.
Okay, thank you. Well, there may be conflict because people are afraid that it's moving the focus on wrong issues, as people have already said here. So if we are talking about sea-based measures, people may think that we are forgetting the external nutrient load reduction importance, and that we do not have to do. And but I think that in these sea-based projects, or any of us are claiming that sea-based measures would save the Baltic Sea. Of course not. Of course we need other measures too. So and another thing which might cause some some conflict or people are afraid that there is a long history of different kind of suggestions of clearly unusable ideas or techniques that are not suitable to be used in the Baltic. They are extremely expensive or technically impossible. So people may think that these sea-based measures are kind of these unusable techniques that should not be used. So these two things comes to my mind of these conflict issues.
Yeah, thank you, Marjo. Seppo. Seppo, can you comment on?
Yes,
yes.
As I already referred to these comments on biomanipulation of the Baltic Sea, these negative reactions are really sometimes confusing, and especially in those cases where it is stated that in the same brief that it is not worth even to study any technical measures. That kind of opinions has also stated sometimes, and as I said, sometimes I have a feeling that it's easier to obtain permits for measures that degrade the state of a sea than measures aiming to improve its state. And at the same time, if you compare a discussion with this going on in the terrestrial environment, for example, the debate on repairing man-made damage is commonplace, and measures are seen as positive and also necessary. You can, for example, raise the study on measures to restore the carbon sequestration capacity of arable land. And that could well be compared to the study of measures to improve the phosphorus retention capacity of a marine sediment. But very often this discussion concerning improving our Baltic Sea takes a negative tone.
Yeah, thank you. I can hear some slight frustration there. Yeah, Jakob, what do you think? Why so conflicting?
Thank you. Yes, I can. I like the way Seppo put it before, but I think one thing is that we are quite used to measures that remove fish. We're used to fishing, so that doesn't seem very threatening. So we tend to fall back on what we have done historically. So one thing is that we rather fish more of something, like fish the stickleback as well, rather than leave the system to improve itself. We're kind of used to our own tools. If you only have a hammer, you're going to use the hammer to solve the problem, sort of. So I think that's one reason that we are more prone to accept those kind of biomanipulation measures, and I think the other thing is that we are a bit scared of chemicals, and we see chemicals as chemicals for a reason. It's because we've had DDTs and pesticides, other pesticides and pollutants that has been a problem for long times. So we sort of equals one chemical or material to another. So we're there's still some kind of scare of chemicals and not being able to make the distinction between chemicals that actually would be beneficial compared to those that are actually dangerous.
Thank you, Jakob. Maria, what is your opinion?
I think that we all have problems with keeping two thoughts in our head at the same time, because often it's my experience is that people are getting us upset when we talk about reducing the external loads to a lake, for example. and people say that, well, there are problems in the lake also. And we are saying that, yeah, we know that. We are working with the internal loading as well. So you can work with this at the same time. And you need to remember that it's possible to do that and keep both things in your head at the same time, because I think that's often is the start of the conflicts. And then I think that we need to try new things, because we're often quite afraid of trying new things. As Jakob said, that we are afraid of chemicals, and of course we should be afraid of chemicals, but we should try stuff, but maybe in a smaller scale then, and just see, can we use this to restore our lakes and bays?
Yeah, thank you. I see that Seppo has raised his hand.
Yes, concerning this chemical issue, I fully agree with Jakob and Maria, but just concerning this marl limestone, which is coming from Gotland, I have said that this material is originated from seabed. It's originally shells of mussels which were created when Gotland was situated a couple of 1,000 kilometers to the south from its position today. And in fact, we are now planning to use these shells of mussels to improve the state of Baltic Sea.
Thank you. Misha, it was anyways your turn.
Well, a very good point by Seppo. I actually wanted to elaborate a little on that and to respond also to biomanipulation discussion in general. Well, if we would bring fisheries and fisheries management into biomanipulation discussion, certainly then we would need to raise the ecosystem-based management in general within HELCOM, and we all know that it is not yet implemented. This is not yet in place. And I actually invite you to the HELCOM stakeholder conference that will address, hopefully, ecosystem-based management, and maybe will little bit more clarity where we are and how we should practically use ecosystem-based management for improving the state of the Baltic Sea. But on the other hand, I would like to respond also to the actual question and express my very blunt opinion, because to me the move forward with the sea-based measures, unfortunately, is so much connected to the economies and money. Money matters. We all understand and we all see that from the national policies, how they are developed, and how unfortunately environmental ministries are struggling against some other influential ministries and not actually receiving support enough to go forward with strict measures. For example, introducing levies on mineral phosphorus and nitrogen and fertilizers. No, ministries of agriculture are saying that, well, it will be too impacting our farmers. The same about introducing mandatory measures like mandatory nutrient balances for farmers. Well, many countries would say, well, we only have voluntary measures. How can we order our farmers to apply these measures? And I can, of course, continue the list. So to us, in that sense, when we see that there are still instruments available, but those are not simply used in national policies, national economic sectorial policies, then we simply say that, well, why should we spend taxpayers' money on investing into sea-based measures while we can really effectively allocate that to address agricultural runoff? So that's our standpoint.
Yeah, sort of avoiding the real measures needed. So yeah, Toni and then Seppo. Toni, you start.
So yeah, one of the things I thought about is, since we still have way too high runoff to the Baltic Sea, a lot of the conflicts are due to the fact that we need to still lower the runoff from land, and we should that's why we should put our main effort on land-based measures that I said earlier also, and not try to shift focus into these sea-based measures. And one thing that's also is creating a lot of speculation and discussion is the long-term effects of sea-based measures. We need to have a better understanding, especially since the Baltic Sea is changing quite rapidly now because of the climate change, for instance. Then one thing that hasn't been brought forward that much today is the legal aspects. We don't really have a great or like a legal framework on what to take into consideration when doing these kind of measures. And also, well, money is also always kind of one thing that creates conflict. Yeah, that was what I had said.
Thank you, Toni. Seppo.
Yes, I fully agree what Misha said concerning this lack of financial possibilities to study more thoroughly this sea-based measure. But I would also say that this negative tone which this conversation quite often takes when we discuss about these sea-based measures is due to missing clear positive signs from former pilot studies, which could give a sign that these measures could really be effective and speed up the recovery of the Baltic Sea. It's self-evident that we have to take these nutrient reduction measures in the catchment, whether we apply sea-based measures or not. But I would have hoped that we could have get more clear positive signs, for example, from this limestone pilot in this study. I think it would have helped in future in implementing of this kind of pilot studies and also use of these measures in larger areas. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to confess that we also, as a foundation, had great hopes, and the lucky thing is that it's not yet completely buried. It's still just a matter of further research, but yeah, we had also high hopes on that one. Next, we will continue for the last hour of this webinar and focus on how the knowledge we have gathered in this project will be used in practice. And the first presenter will be Miina Mäki, who is project manager from the John Nurminen Foundation, and she has been the captain of the sea-based ship for the last 3 years. So Miina, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjukka. And as a captain, first of all, I would like to thank my fabulous crew of this journey that we have been going through together, because without your work and your pilots, we couldn't have compiled any of these outputs I'm going to now shortly present. Next slide, please. One of the main outputs of the sea-based project will be the practical guidelines for these measures. And the aim of the guidelines is to be a compilation of neutral and verified information on different aspects related to the sea-based measures, including sustainability from the point of view of ecology of the Baltic Sea, but also from legal, social and economic points of view. And costs and technical feasibility of measures are, of course, one important part of this. These guidelines have been prepared together with project partnership and also in close cooperation with different stakeholders. We have been collecting stakeholders' views via interviews, workshops, and discussion forums. Of course, this current pandemic has put a little challenges to organizing live events, but luckily we have been able to reach many of the stakeholders virtually or online interviews as well. And what we hope we can provide with this document is practical guidance for anyone who might be planning to carry out such sea-based measures in the future, but also a support document for decision makers, for example, environmental permitting authorities who should take a view or standpoint on the permit applications they might be receiving. And of course, we hope that we can also give some input to the national and HELCOM level decision making by bringing this information available. Next, please. This is just to show the contents or structure of the document, how it will be. I will not go through all of these sections in this presentation. I don't have the time for that, but instead I will take a closer look into some of these most important or crucial matters that we have been discussing today already earlier. For example, the legislative matters we will not be discussing so much today. They have been reviewed already before in other projects, so in the guideline document we will not write all of that again, but we will take a short look on what has been written before, and then gather some practical experiences from permitting of our pilots, for example. Next, please. First, I wanted to talk about these impact assessments related to implementation of any of these measures that can be counted as sea-based. One important aspect in sustainability assessments, of course, is the ecological sustainability. And impact assessment is always needed if some sea-based activities are being planned, and the assessment then should aim at first identifying the potential ecological effects in the ecosystem, but also the benefits and risks that might be caused via those effects. And in addition, it's important to understand the direction of the effect as well as the extent, both in time and space, meaning that how long one would expect that the effect will last and whether it has an effect, for example, the neighboring water areas, or can we restrict the effect into the pilot area only. And by thorough evaluation, we can then hopefully identify the most urgent risks and maybe set some thresholds, so-called no-goes, which cannot be exceeded while planning these measures. And all of these should also be considered when evaluating the applicability of future pilots in any regions of the Baltic Sea. Next, please. About selecting the suitable sites for these measures, as we have already heard before today, identified or verified significant leakage of phosphorus from the bottom sediments is one of the kind of assumption that should be fulfilled before even considering utilizing sea-based measures. Because if there is no leakage from the sediment, then it's no use to target any measures on it. And also the external loading should be reduced first, because otherwise it wouldn't make any difference to kind of tackle the internal load if the external load is continuing as before. Closed conditions for the area of pilot activities is recommended because then it's easier to control and limit the effects to be local and not having any surprising effects on neighboring areas. And what's useful to have is monitoring data already before implementation, long term if possible, then there is something to compare the effects of the measure. If one don't know the circumstances before implementation, then it's a bit hard to say if there was any effect or not. And specific attention should be paid to the hazardous substances that might be buried in the sediments of coastal bay areas. And whatever the circumstances at the selected sites are, the selection of measures should always be based on the site-specific conditions. So you cannot copy-paste these activities from one place to another without thorough investigation of each site beforehand. And there are also some very shallow bay areas with very high pools of mobile phosphorus. And if planning sea-based measures in such environments where the bottom is not dead, there are plants and bottom fauna existing in the bay, then special attention should be paid to the ecological impact assessment before implementing any sea-based measures on such areas. Next, please. Risk management is of course important when the risk has been identified. Then monitoring and keeping eye on the possible long-term effects is important. And there are some potential high-level risks that should be considered before applying sea-based measures. As already have been mentioned while hearing the results from the pilots. Next, please. This is a kind of a visual presentation of a process that should be taken while planning a project. I'm not going to go this through in detail, but something that we can conclude, there are some preconditions that should be taken into account when planning a project. And then as you can see from the picture, these are not simple and easy projects to carry on, but there are lots of things to consider and a lot of resources might be needed to fulfill each of these steps. So this tells us that these projects should not be carried out on light basis, but they should be thoroughly considered. Next, please. Then we mapped a bit about the views from environmental authorities towards the sea-based measures. Questionnaire was sent approximately 240 representatives of regional authorities, mostly environmental authorities in Sweden, Finland, Åland, Islands and Estonia, and we got 54 answers. We had lots of questions in the questionnaire, and then we had one opportunity to choose 1 to 5 options for the given alternatives. And from those answers, I will show some compilations. All of them will be included in the guideline documentation later on. Next, please. Most relevant benefits that were raised were closely related to the restoration of local ecological circumstances of the marine environment. And the most relevant risks, instead, they were actually more related to economic aspects than harming environment or these ecological risks, which to me at least was a bit surprising. But I would think that the these answers reflect the pressures that are related to ambitious targets in water protection plans and the anxiety on available resources to reach these targets. So here we can see that hope is definitely something that is needed among also these environmental regional authorities that have to fulfill the goals that has been set for water protection, national and regional levels. Next, please. And what hinders the use of sea-based measures? Lack of information got the highest score, so to say, and resources were right next to it. So I hope we can bring a bit of that information available via this project, and the funding issue is something that should be brought forward to the political level decision making, that these are really topics that needs to be need to have enough resources to be able to fulfill the targets set for marine protection in the future. Next, please. What about the cost efficiency then? We had made some calculations. All the analyses are not ready yet, so that's why I will not be showing any numbers yet, but some conclusions. We have only included the verified costs while making the estimations, and here you can see the list of the measures which there were some costs existing already. For the other measures, missing information on costs or the efficiency of the measure in phosphorus removal prevents these reliable calculations. And some previous calculations that have been presented in public have been partly distorted by using, for example, unrealistic assumption for the market value of removed biomasses, for example, marine sediments. I think that doesn't give a realistic view or information on the cost efficiency if there is no verification on the cost or potential values. Next, please. For these so-called geo-engineering measures, calculating actual cost efficiency is impossible if there is a lack of information on phosphorus removal or on implementation costs. So further investigation is needed first to gather all this information. And for some measures, as we heard, even the coastal scale pilots have turned out to be too expensive. So this implies poor cost efficiency or major technical development needs, or both. So as a conclusion, some of these measures could be used in local scale to support load reductions from land-based sources, but most of large-scale measures might be clearly less cost-effective than the current land-based measures. Next, please. For the biomass removal measures, some examples of them here. Market value, of course, for the biomass is decisive for cost efficiency and the economic sustainability when thinking about the future or continuation of the activity. And even though the amount of nutrients can be quite easily verified and calculated from the weight of the biomass removed, it's often difficult or impossible to prove any improvements directly on local water quality, for example. However, some of these measures based on biomass removal seem to be cost efficient, and when saying cost efficient, we can talk, for example, costs that are below 200 euros per removed phosphorus kilogram from the marine environment. And the cost efficiency is existing even if there is no assumption on any market values for the biomass. So from that perspective, some of these measures could be utilized already now. Next, please. To the conclusions, we started to look for some information, and now I could conclude that we have some light, a little, but at least a bit more than when we started the project. And suitability of these measures is always site-specific, as we have heard many times during the discussions today. But also what is important, that results from one site can't be directly applied to other locations. And as well, concerning large-scale open sea applications, there are no techniques that would be mature enough yet to be applied. And the results from these local pilots can't be directly applied to open sea environment as such, because there are so big differences in the ecosystem of these environments. Also, the impacts might not be restricted to the marine environment. For example, thinking of a sediment deposition or harvesting of feed, or any such measure that would affect also, for example, the coastal zone on land. Every cost estimate should be based on realistic information on both costs and the nutrient reduction efficiency of the measure. And some of the sea-based measures could be cost efficient in local scale, while still continuing the load reductions from land as a supportive measures. And next, please. More research and technical development is clearly needed for future applications, especially of the so-called geo-engineering measures. And there are also large knowledge gaps existing, for example, in understanding of the sediment processes in open sea ecosystems, nutrient cycles in sediments, and of course the impacts of the climate change to the Baltic Sea marine environment. And maybe the most crucial thing that we have learned is that proper monitoring and documentation of all steps in these pilot projects is very important. Otherwise, the coming future projects cannot learn anything from something that has been done, and maybe the only information that is available might be picture before and picture after. Such documentation is not enough. So to conclude, focus should be kept in reducing land-based load, as we already heard wise words from the panelists. And some of the sea-based measures still could be cost efficient for utilization in small-scale local marine protection as a supportive measures. And there are some novel measures that are showing potential, but need still further research and technical development. And next, please. Thank you. This was all from my side.
Thank you, Miina. We don't have any questions from audience at this point, so we will move on with the program, and the next speaker will again be Annika Brink from Government of Åland, but this time she will be presenting us a concept of aquatic compensations in Åland. Annika, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Hi again. I will be presenting one of our missions within the SEABASED project, and this mission was to develop a concept of nutrient compensation in the aquatic coastal environment. So first of all, what is compensation? Well, if you look into the dictionary, it says that it's something that is given or received as an equivalent for damage, loss, or injury. So basically, compensation measures are an indemnification of a negative impact on our environment that is caused by human activity. And why should we compensate at all? Why do we need to do this? Well, it started with the Vesa ruling in the European Court of Justice in 2015. And this ruling empowered the Water Framework Directive, saying that member states may not authorize projects which may cause a deterioration of the status of a surface water body unless derogation is granted. So, of course, this is a bit problematic if you're in need of renewal or approval of your permits, and if you have an activity that might emit some nutrients to the aquatic environment. But if we can compensate, this would present a win-win situation for the entrepreneur and also for the environment. Let's look at some central concepts when we talk about compensation. First of all, we have the mitigation hierarchy. This was established by the international corporation BBOP, and it's not legally binding, but it has become somewhat of a golden standard. If you want to do an activity that might harm the environment in some way, first of all, you should avoid what can be avoided, protect what can be protected, and restore what can be restored. Then in the end, you will be left with something called a residual impact, and it's this impact that we need to compensate for. We also have additionality, and that means that the compensation measure must be new and would not have taken place without the offset. Another concept is no net loss, and that means that the amount of nutrients that have been removed equals the amount that was released. So we want to reach a ±0 level. Compensation comes in many forms, so we need to be on the same page here and know what we're talking about. These concepts overlap to some extent, and they can also interact with each other. So the focus for environmental compensation can be almost any aspect of the environment. And if you look at biodiversity offsetting, these are measurable conservation outcomes, and the goal with them is always to reach the no net loss level. Ecological compensation, on the other hand, is a wider concept that takes into account the whole ecosystem. And ecological compensation actually may have lesser goals than reaching the no net loss level and can result in a partial compensation. It's also possible to compensate for ecosystem services, that is the benefits that we get from nature. And we have all heard about climate compensation with focus on carbon dioxide. In the SEABASED project, we have worked with nutrient compensation, and a nutrient offset can be defined as a unit of additional nutrient reduction and should also be measurable. So while ecological compensation is possible in theory, it is quite tricky to incorporate it into legislation. We have a need for supervision and demonstration of the effects. So when we are working with nutrient compensation, we can rely on some models for nutrient reduction, and this facilitates the work a little bit. Compensation should also be done where we have the negative impact. This is a bit problematic, as here in Åland, for example, we have 61 water bodies. And the water body where you need to do the compensation might not be suitable for so many compensation measures. So it can be a bit tricky. But these water bodies are also clustered into 14 monitoring areas. And we can do the compensation inside of a monitoring area, knowing that this will benefit the impacted water body, as water bodies within one monitoring area have similar characteristics. But if you want to do a compensation outside of the monitoring area where the impact has occurred, then there is a heavier burden of proof to show the effect of the Compensation Act. So let's look into the concept that we developed. To do this, we procured a consultant team consisting of experts from Syke and the Swedish Ministry of the Environment. Our goal was to develop a concept of aquatic compensation with focus on nutrients, but within an ecological context. We looked at legal, ecological, and financial administrative aspects, and we have discussed different compensation measures that can be utilized. So I will now just briefly go through what's in the report, and then you can read more about it later on. For the legal aspects, first of all, what does EU law say about compensation? Well, neither the Water Framework Directive nor the Marine Strategy Framework Directive mention compensation as such. However, the directives emphasize that member states shall implement necessary measures to reach the environmental objectives. And compensation measures can then be a tool in achieving these environmental goals. There is nothing in the directives that contradicts the use of compensation methods. The report also makes a comparison of compensation in different countries, and there exist several possibilities for compensation, but no one has yet implemented a complete system. Most compensation work has also been done on land, and there are not so many examples from the aquatic environment. When it comes to the ecological aspects, we need to know that we have adequate measures on both the temporal and spatial scale, and we need to know the effect of different measures on the ecosystem. We also have to figure out the capacity for nutrient removal and if there are any potential risks for the ecosystem. For the financial and administrative aspects, we have, for example, that compensation can be voluntary or mandatory, and a compensation system can be run by the public or private sector or a combination of both. If we want a market-based system, then there is a need for a demand for compensation, and you will get an increase in the demand if compensation is made mandatory. It's also important to pinpoint that the public sector is crucial to define laws, rules, and the frameworks to work within. So let's have a look at the compensation measures that we discuss in the report. We have, for example, different ways of removing biomass. It can be in the form of cultivated macroalgae, mussels, harvesting of common reed, or fishing, for example, the three-spine stickleback. We can irrigate with nutrient-rich brackish water, remove nutrient-rich sediments, and there are also different ways of permanently binding phosphorus into the sediments. Then we can also combine these measures with land-based measures within the catchment area. So you can read more about these measures in the report, but for each and every one of them, we discuss the nutrient removal capacity and the effect of the measure on the ecosystem. So what are the next steps when it comes to compensation, and where do we go from here? Well, first of all, we have to start with EU law, because that is sort of the foundation for all legislation nowadays. And keep legislation simple with clear definitions. We also need to adapt a step-by-step approach and have a feedback loop and learn from our mistakes. We need more tools for the permit processes, like we need to put a price for nutrient emissions. We need to have verified methods and legal decrees to follow. Then we should also continue to learn from what other countries have done and look at their experience. We need to gain social acceptance of compensation within the public-private sector and from stakeholders and the general public. We also need to develop the models for nutrient loading and remember that it's not always about land-based or sea-based, what we can use a combination of these measures. And don't forget that new projects can act as a bridge between theory and practice and give us more knowledge. So you can find the compensation report at the website of the Government of Åland and also at the website of the SEABASED project. And there you can dig into the parts that you would like to learn more about. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Next, we get to hear a comment by Associate Professor Lena Bergström from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So let's go to Lena's comments. Lena, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You can skip this first slide, please. Go directly to the next one. So I'm a researcher at SLU Aqua in Sweden, and I'm part of the SEABASED steering group. And I'm also involved currently in the compensation issue in a project focusing on biodiversity and ecosystem services, which is carried out together with colleagues at SLU and other organizations in Sweden. So next slide, please. So as a background to my intervention here, in parallel with the SEABASED project, there's been a national research investment in Sweden, which is involving in total 7 projects on environmental compensation from different aspects. And I just included this slide in the beginning, mainly so you can come back to it later and have a closer look. And these projects are finishing up at the moment, and there will come publications and reports during 2021 still. So next slide, please. So then to begin, what sparked the research initiative is actually, as also evident from Annika's presentation and the one from Mina, that there is a growing interest in these issues and in the use of compensation as a management tool. At the same time, we know that we know very little about the issue and there are many questions to address. And this is true when it comes to the research background, but also in implementation experience. In Sweden, we estimated that less than 1/6 of all managers in coastal areas that could be turning to compensation as a tool in their daily work are actually using it. But the remaining part are either not familiar with the concept or they have not been successful when trying to push for it, for example, in permitting processes for unknown reasons. And we find it very important to resolve the background for this gap. Next slide, please. So in the following slides, I will briefly touch upon some key issues that we have observed in our work. And I think they also apply well to what Annika outlined just for the Åland case. And my aim is then to suggest some things that managers and companies and others need to be particularly concerned with in the future development. And the first fact comes from that we recognize that the term compensation is used in a very wide sense. And this nice graph, we saw it already, was produced within SEABASED, and it illustrates how the different types of compensation relate to each other and how they may overlap. And we see that the focus can be on environmental compensation as a whole or on selected aspects, such as, for example, nutrients. Next slide, please. As we also heard from Annika, it's crucial to understand the mitigation hierarchy and to ensure that it's followed. However, we recognize that this mitigation hierarchy is sometimes applied in different ways in different situations. This can be the case when you compare between countries, but also within countries, depending on if one is involved in a permitting process or a planning process. And this variation has implication for how one defines unavoidable damage. In this graph that you see here, unavoidable damage is illustrated as the remaining part of the loss after all possible action to reduce losses at the site have been implemented already. And this is, in a sense, the part that is most usually traded off in a situation of new development, that is, unless it is compensated for in some way. Next slide, please. So compensation, the red box in this graph, is set to offset this unavoidable damage so that no net loss is reached, as you can see there on the far right. And preferably one should reach something called net environmental gain, which is furthest to the right. And when we have such a surplus, habitat banking or other mechanisms at larger scale may also play in, as you have actually no loss anymore, but a net gain from your measure. Next slide, please. Another clear advantage of the compensation process is that it can be a way to enforce the polluter pays principle in practice. However, in areas that are already subject to high pressure, one has to be very careful to distinguish between compensation on the one side and between restoration measures we would have needed to take place anyway. Next slide, please. And last, I would like to take you back to my first point that many types of compensations exist and that they may overlap in scope. So how do we select the most suitable measure in a given situation, in a given situation, given that we have these potentially multiple goals? Here we illustrated this case with an example of the many ways in which eelgrass meadow can contribute to ecosystem services and benefits to humans. And as a minimum, we want to ensure that the measures that are implemented to remedy one of these ecosystem services or benefits do not have a negative effect on any of the others. For example, of the benefits of reduced eutrophication or reduced CO2 in the atmosphere, as you can see here depicted in the middle of the picture. And ideally, we would want to use measures that can have positive or synergistic side effects. So that was all from me. Thank you. I could give my credits to my colleagues and co-workers on the project that contributed to these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Leena. After Leena's presentation, I opened the floor for questions, and we have a bit less time than we planned to have for that, but let's try to answer at least some questions that we have gotten to the chat box. So there was a question already during the panel discussion on, it goes like this: most anoxic bottoms are found in the open seas. Any best guesses of when any type of measure could be tested in this environment? So would any of our panelists or anyone else be willing to give any guesses on this question?
Do we still have Jouni online?
Yes, I'm here. Well, what I'm thinking of is that I would prefer really solid information and results from these small scale experiments, and after that to go to larger areas step by step. And of course there are now an ongoing modeling research in SMHA where they are thinking of the modeling of the oxygenation of the main basin of the Baltic Sea. And this kind of modeling work can give quite nice information what could happen if we do such large-scale oxygenation pumpings, what they have been planning to do. But I would say that in a way we have to start from small semi-enclosed basins.
Okay, so no answer like 2030 or 2040 or no guesses on that?
No guesses from that.
Good. Okay, then there is a question to Miina. From the project manager perspective, which technology do you see as most interesting going forward? So Miina, please.
Thank you. Well, if we think about technologies or these maybe so-called geoengineering measures, then I would say that the application with a treated marl is obviously worth of further development. And then these, maybe you could say, softer measures linked to the habitat restoration and irrigation of fields, for example, or stickleback fishing, they could be in smaller scale taken into use already now, of course, with a proper assessments and so on. But there is a difference in these measures to these more novel ones, which need still more development work.
Thank you, Miina. I see that there is a question on compensations. So how to ensure that the compensation is properly measured against the original damage? Without proper comparison, it can lead to greenwash. So would Annika, either Annika or Lena be willing to answer to this question?
I can give a comment on that one. Well, that is the tricky question. When it comes to nutrients, it's more straightforward, as you can measure the kilograms that you release and the kilograms that you take up. But if you want to do, for example, ecological compensation, there are so many different variables that need to put a price on them, or yeah, there have been different trials to do this, but I haven't yet seen a complete system for doing it. So that is sort of the bottleneck in starting to use compensation methods.
Yeah. Is Lena willing to comment something on this?
I can just agree, and this is exactly the kind of issues that we are trying to approach and currently struggling with. And this is a very valid criticism that we do not want this to lead to what's referred to here as greenwashing. On the other hand, I think the main point is that if you don't have this tool, compensation, to turn to, in the case that there is in fact development, you effectively greenwash or ignore the damage anyway because you're not putting any value to it. So what we're trying to find is a way to measure the losses that are ongoing, that are currently invisible, that just because you cannot measure them, they're still there. So the big challenge is, as Annika said, is how to quantify them in a way that you can use this information in management.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I see Misha raising his hand. Misha, please.
Yeah. Thank you. And if I get the compensation thing correctly, I would like also to give another example which raises concern, and that's particularly the case of fish farming and suggestion to use internal load measures as a compensation measures for reducing the impact from fish farming. Well, sorry to say, but we know that there are preventative strategies that would probably lead to more reduction than introducing sea-based measures as a compensation. For example, we are talking right now in HELCOM community about sustainable fish farming in the Baltic Sea or sustainable aquaculture in the Baltic Sea. And we all know that, in fact, with the current state, with open sea aquaculture, with the cages, we cannot reach good environmental status. We are all aware of that. We know about the impact that currently comes from open sea cages. And I think Åland Islands, that's a very good example. But we know that land-based circular solutions for aquaculture proves that we can reach, on one hand, efficient economic systems, and on the other hand, we can trap all the nutrients from reaching the sea. So that's one concern that I wanted to raise. I actually think I had another, but now I think I forgot, but maybe I will come back.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Annika, you raised your hand.
Yes, Mikhail, you're correct. But many of the techniques that you mentioned with fish farming actually would not, they would be done anyway as part of the best ecological practice or best available technique. So they would come in more early in the mitigation hierarchy And it would be something that you would need to do anyways before you start using compensation measures.
Thank you, Annika, for that point. I think we have to proceed in the program, not to keep you here forever. So the next comment we will hear from Samu Nurminen, who has been the project manager from the financier side. So Samu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Miina. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Great. Then I will just start. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I have the pleasure of bringing greetings from the Central Baltic program into this event. We are, of course, partly financing the SEABASED project, which is now coming to a conclusion this spring. In the Central Baltic program, we finance lots of projects of different kinds. Currently, we have, I think, 137 projects that have been contracted. A major part, of course, already ended. But they cover things all the way from increasing business opportunities to improving transport corridors, and from developing, for example, urban planning to promoting social inclusion. And well, I guess you could say they have one thing in common anyway. They all want to make a difference, and they want to achieve a change to make our living environment better. Our environmental projects basically have worked with the topics of sustainable tourism, urban, coastal and maritime planning, and improving the state of the Baltic Sea. These are all huge tasks, to be sure, but innovative projects such as SEABASED, for example, will help in putting together the solutions puzzle. It has been already said today, and it's very clear that money is always needed. And with our still quite modest funding possibilities, considering, of course, the extent of the environmental challenges, we have specifically wanted to bring into focus the cooperation across borders. And SEABASED has also nicely demonstrated this, involving partners from Sweden, Finland, including also Åland, and I was happy to notice that also Estonian colleagues had been invited in as a target group for the survey. Out of our around 35 environmental projects, I would say about 15 have more or less directly worked with improving the state of the Baltic Sea. SEABASED itself has taken important steps towards managing the nutrient load at the point when it's already reached the sea. Of course, concluding also that it is still most effective and maybe especially most cost effective to deal with the nutrient load closer to its original sources. However, it's clear that it's also possible to work with the nutrients that are already in the system, especially on local level. And towards this, the project has also taken a nice approach through the selection of pilot measures. Yes, to conclude, on behalf of the financier, I would like to thank all the partners and their experts who have been involved in the SEABASED project. And maybe this is also a good opportunity to provide a quick glimpse into the future of the Central Baltic program. The previous program period of the program ended a little bit less than a month ago, and planning for the next period has been ongoing for a good while already. And I can say that issues related to improving the state of the Baltic Sea are likely to be strongly on the agenda also in the future. And actually, you can all have your say on the new program by participating to the public hearing, which will actually start already next week. So check out our website for things related to this. We also look forward to opening a call for new projects later this year. The time of this will be confirmed later. I guess this is all from my and the program side at this point. Please, everyone, stay safe and healthy, and remember to keep brewing these new project ideas. And thank you for this very interesting and informative afternoon.
Thank you, Samu. It was very informative and interesting also for us, because it's good to hear that the financing continues and you are interested in financing Baltic Sea protection also in the future. Dear friends, I think it's about the time for the final words. So I want to begin by thanking our co-financier, the Interreg Central Baltic Program. It is so important that for Baltic Sea protection that your financing enables novel experiments like this. I want to also thank each and every partner of the project. Stockholm University's Department of Ecology, Environment and Plant Sciences, County Administrative Board of Östergötland County, the Government of Åland, Fish Farmers Association of Åland, and Center for Economic Development, Transport and the Environment of Southwestern Finland. You were brave enough to make history and jump into this 3 years underwater journey with us. I want to conclude our webinar by sharing some views on the future of sea-based measures, which we have gained during this project. Firstly, as we have heard many times today, it is self-evident that land-based measures are still the key for recovering our eutrophied Baltic Sea. This is so due to uncertainties, risks, technical challenges, and high cost associated with sea-based measures. However, sea-based measures could give us hope, especially in recovering relatively enclosed, heavily eutrophied small sea areas, such as Björnöfjärden in Sweden or Kolka Bay in Finland. For areas like this, their external loading has been significantly reduced, but the old sins, legacy nutrients, keep running the vicious circle. They could be in some cases the very last hope. Secondly, understanding fears, moral standpoints, risk perceptions and views about sea-based measures was one of our main goals. And in this we found out that the discussion about sea-based measures often circles around their applicability in open sea areas or abysses like the Arkona or Gotland basin, leading into heated and conflicting views. However, there is much more consensus about their application in small and enclosed areas like the Kolka Bay, where they could be, as said, the last hope for the whole ecosystem. It seems to me that due to their sheer financial and technical challenges, sea-based measures will not be ripe for open sea or abyss applications for decades to come. So why is then the whole discussion focused on that? Should we instead be pragmatic and focus our discussion and efforts to small-scale, single bay or sea area cases where it is realistic and possible to use sea-based measures already during our lifetime? Thirdly, it was frustrating to find out how poorly documented and monitored many of the previous sea-based experiments have been. There are a lot of theories and ideas, but when the measures have been tried out in real Baltic Sea ecosystem conditions, many pilots have been designed without proper research setup. As a society, we keep wasting our resources in trials like this. Nothing can be concluded about the effects and risks of novel measures without scientific setup and long enough monitoring arrangements. The Björnöfjärden experiments, of course, provide an excellent example of how we should plan and study sea-based measures. Dear listeners, although we may sometimes see the best way forward differently, we all share the same goal. Let us not forget about that, even if our views differ. We all hope to heal our precious and beloved sea. Let us not lose our hope for that. I want to end this webinar with nothing less than Amanda Gorman's words. For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Thank you.